This afternoon, we are very lucky to have Mahesh Rangarajan. Professor Rangarajan holds a BA in history with honors from Delhi University, an MA and a PhD from Oxford University. He is director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in New Delhi, while on leave from his position as professor of history at Delhi University. He is also a well-known columnist and essayist, contributing to the lively public discourse of contemporary India through his writing on wildlife conservation as well as political and environmental issues. In 2010, he led the Elephant Task Force of the Indian Ministry of Environment and Forests. Mahesh is the author or editor of an extraordinary breadth of scholarly work, including Fencing the Forest, Conservation and Ecological Change in India's Central Provinces, 1860 to 1914, Battles Over Nature, Science and the Politics of Conservation, Making Conservation Work, Securing Biodiversity in this New Century, Environmental History, As If Nature Existed, and most recently, India's Environmental History, a 2-volume compendium published by Permanent Black in 2011. His new projects include Conserving Nature as If Democracy Mattered, and Nature and Nation, Essays on the Environmental History of India, which is currently in press. Today, he will speak to us on nature's past, nature's futures, perspectives on India's environmental history. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rangarajan.
Thank you, Mark. Very generous, if not always accurate introduction. It's very dangerous with edited books. If someone asks me, do you agree with so-and-so, I say, I never wrote that. I just looked at the typos. I think, before one begins, it's interesting to postmark the year we're in, and particularly because this is a program on the global environment. 2012 marks 50 years of the anniversary of a very significant book in the late 20th century, some of whose findings are relevant, and I'll come to them later, in looking at India's environment. And I refer, of course, to Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. The other is a different kind of anniversary. In September, it will be 40 years since the first UN Conference on the Human Environment, which was held, of course, at Stockholm. Now, the Conference of the Human Environment was a UN conference. They sent out invites to all the various heads of government and state. Only 2 turned up. One was Olof Palme. He was the host, wasn't he? But the other was Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of India. I was just struck, and it's something I think we should postmark, because we are looking at the environment at a global level, even though I'll most of the time talk about India, that in a fascinating book, which I think is one of the most remarkable pieces of writing, which takes the findings of science and talks about the larger world, one of Rachel Carson's major concerns was that science, in the way it related to the natural world, was reductionist, tended to break things into parts and not look at the whole. And in a somewhat uncharacteristic polemical vein, she also referred to entomology as a Stone Age science. I know there are practitioners of various disciplines, and these charges are hurled at each of us every day by various people. But I think that, in a sense, when we look at the notions of nature's past and nature's futures, we have to draw on the insights of work such as that of Rachel Carson. We also have to deal with the world of politics. In her very interesting and significant address to the UN Conference on the Human Environment, Indira Gandhi used the following phrase. She said, "Poverty is the worst polluter." The many reams of prose which have been written exposing why this was not so, and poverty is more complex. As with other quotations, Marx writing that religion is the opiate of the masses, this is an incomplete quote. If you read the entire paragraph, it goes on to say, among other things, that the poor do have the right to a better life, to access to technology, to modern science. And you cannot expect, she went on to write, the people who live in a forest with large wild animals and wildlife to protect that forest unless their basic needs are taken care of. This is again a theme I'll return to as we speak. But located as we are in the shadow of the 20th century, as a student of history, we were brought up with certain very important insights in the 20th century. It's a century of war, two great conflagrations, the First and the Second World War. It was a century of revolutions. We could begin with the Mexican, the Bolshevik, work our way through. It was a century of profound economic, political, and social transformation. The First World War alone led to the breakup of 5 great empires. It led to convulsions, which weakened, as we know, the other great colonial empires, whose demise came after the Second World War. But to a historian looking at the 20th century, one recalls the words of John McNeill, who said that the 20th century was really something new under the sun. If you looked at the 20th century from the beginning to the end, the number of people on the planet went up 4-fold. The gross world product went up 14-fold. So by the end of the 20th century, there were more people than there'd ever been. They'd created more wealth than they ever had. And needless to add, and important for us, they'd also created more waste than anyone ever had. By the end of the 20th century, someone riding a road roller or driving a large 4-wheel drive had more energy at his or her disposal than a medieval or an ancient emperor. But the other point about the 20th century, which is more attendant about what I want to talk about today, is to realize that while these changes affected the planet, and the planet is unified by various ecological processes, it's unified by the prevailing winds, by ocean currents, by the migration of birds, the movement, one shouldn't forget, of tectonic plates, and so on and so forth, that this unified planet is actually broken up into various nation states. 1914 marked a very important moment in the beginning of the Great War. And between 1914 and today, the number of nation states on the earth has also gone up, interestingly, 4-fold. So you have a planet which is more unified and integrated in economic terms. It continues to be unified and integrated in ecological terms, but it's more broken up into competing sovereignties in terms of nation states. Any attempt to look at nature's past, nature's futures, and how one builds in India's environmental history has therefore to take these larger changes into account. One way to do it, of course, is to go back again to anniversaries. I began with, so many years after Silent Spring, 40 years after Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Let me go back to a coup in 1972. It's a coup I'm sure some of you may have missed. And 1972 was the year of the SALT II Accords. It was the year of the Hanoi Agreement, short-lived, between the various parties to the war in Vietnam. In India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, fresh from the victory of the liberation of Bangladesh, dissolved the state assemblies, went to the polls, and created effectively a new kind of political order, which had, of course, been taking shape earlier. But 1972 was also, for me, as someone who tries to look at environmental histories, a different kind of year of a different kind of coup. It was, to put it simply, the year when the lion lost its throne. When India became independent in 1947, there was a big debate on what animal you should have as a national animal and what bird you should have as a national bird. It might interest you to know, as an aside, that there was a debate whether it should be the lion or the elephant. Now, the lion would have been a logical animal to pick. The lion has been a symbol of sovereignty down the ages. If you look at Sanskritic literature, a king or an emperor is supposed to sit on a simhasana, a lion's throne. You could actually argue that the metaphor of the lion was used not only by rulers who wielded military and political power, but even by people who reached out to the mind and, if you like, the soul. Late 1999, 3 of us were sitting on a road in the Gir forest, the only place in Asia where you can see lions. And we were looking for a pair of 2 male lions. And around 6 in the morning, you have to hear it in the forest to know it, there was an earth-shattering roar. I don't think it shattered the earth, it just felt like that. But when you hear that, you realize why the first sermon of the Buddha, for instance, is known as the Simhanada. And the Buddha himself was known as Shakta Simha, the Simha of the Shaktas. So it's no surprise that the lion was chosen as national animal, which leads you to a question: what happened in 1972 which led the lion to lose its throne? Writing in a very interesting Nature magazine a few years later, a young Indian schoolboy actually wrote a poem lamenting the loss of the lion's throne. He wrote, "Lion, O lion of Gujarat, the tiger be no rival to thee, though he has seized thy throne. But thy numbers are grown so small that it is even possible in the forest of Gir to hold a roll call." There's a clue over there. The tiger became the national animal. The lion lost that status. It continued to be the state animal of Gujarat. It's still the state animal of Gujarat. Asked about why the lion had been replaced by the tiger, the then chairman of the steering committee of Project Tiger, chairman, in fact, of the executive council of the library I now head, so I have to be very careful what I say. He was asked, why has the tiger replaced the lion? And Dr. Karan Singh, who had the nickname Tiger, he came from a princely family, they had all these strange nicknames. He said that lion is found in only one state of the Indian Union. The tiger is found in 11 out of 16 states of India. The tiger is a symbol of unity in diversity. The first director of Project Tiger went much further. In his book written a few years later, in 1978, Kailash Sankla, he was an amateur historian, and there were a lot of other insights of his which one would buy. He argued that the lion as a symbol was an alien import. And he referred to the tiger seal of Harappa, going back 5,000 years, very famous tiger seal of, some people say, a proto-Siva, certainly an ascetic seated on a tiger seal. And he said that the lion then came in, and all that they had done in making the tiger the national animal was to restore the tiger to his rightful place from where the lion had ruled meaninglessly for several centuries. Now, the bestowing of the tiger as national animal, of course, went together with a number of executive and legislative changes. 3 years prior to that, tiger hunting was banned. The export of tiger skins stopped. The same year, 1972, a new Wildlife Protection Act written into law. The very large project known as Project Tiger was launched a year later. It was in its day the world's largest single wildlife conservation project. It continues to be active to this day. At the core of it was a very interesting ideology which is crucial to understanding the links between nature's pasts and futures. They selected about 9 areas where tigers would be conserved. And Sankla, of course, quite rightly said that the tiger cannot be seen in isolation. He argued that the tiger is at the apex of the ecological pyramid. If you have a healthy population of tigers, it means the prey base is intact. If the prey base is intact, that means the habitat is intact, and so on and so forth. And in his first press conference, even directors of projects do get to hold press conferences, he was asked by a journalist, what do you plan to do in these tiger reserves? And he said, our philosophy is very simple. We plan to do nothing. We plan to do nothing and not let anybody do anything. We will let nature find its own place. Now, given the history of Indian forestry, which goes back to the latter half of the 19th century, which was primarily and largely focused on extracting timber and generating revenue, this was in its own way a very, very profound transformation. And over the period since then, there are now 40 tiger reserves, not 9. There were these core areas designated where, among other things, commercial forestry was stopped. India not only had a tradition of forestry going back to the imperial and colonial period, it also had a tradition where within these forest areas, certain species were classified as vermin. I'm not sure how many people in this room have seen a tiger in the wild, but I'm sure many of you have heard or have read the Jungle Book by Kipling. And you may recall that Mowgli's peaceable forest is invaded by an animal called the dhole, the red dog of the Deccan. And Kipling, of course, got his ecology wrong. The wild dog is an animal of the forest, and it's the wolf which is the animal of the Deccan. But this particular allegory of the wild dog actually had a real-life counterpart. Wild dogs continued to be killed as vermin right up to the 1970s. It's roughly the size of a Jack Russell Terrier, a little larger. It's a very, very lovely-looking animal which lives in small packs. And it's only with the coming of Project Tiger that animals like the wild dog stopped being eliminated. Project Tiger had an underside, which I think is very crucial. We've already seen what it did at the apex. It nationalized the tiger. It transformed the tiger into a symbol of India. There was a kind of ecological patriotism which was being promoted in the new India. It's an India which was seen as a leader of the developing world. It was fresh from a major confrontation with the United States of America over the issue of Bangladesh. It was also a country subject to sanctions from 1974 for certain critical technical inputs because of the explosion of Pokhran. But the underside is very crucial. Just as the nation incorporated nature, the tiger being at the apex, it also did something else. It practiced a kind of unity in diversity which didn't necessarily unify all the inhabitants of those forest, scrub, or marsh areas. A fascinating book, which I really think is probably going to be a marker for people who do this body of work, called The Forest of Tigers, It's drawn upon extensively in Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide. Anu Jalai talks about what happens in a fascinating area of the Sundarbans, a mangrove forest which abuts the two nation states, Bangladesh and West Bengal. It's an area which spans about 10,000 square kilometers. About a third of the Indian Sundarbans became a tiger reserve. And a few years after this, in 1978, the inhabitants of a village known as Marijhapi were asked to decamp. They had to make way for the tiger, the wild boar, the deer, the crocodile, and other such creatures which lived in the forest. They refused. They had already been displaced twice. They'd once been displaced from East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. They'd been resettled in central India in an area where they were unable to make a living. They'd been brought back at the invitation of senior politicians in Bengal and being given this land which seemed to be fallow. And lo and behold, they were being displaced again. Before writing her book, Anu Jalai wrote a much more hard-hitting article which was called Refugees as Tiger Food. And in a sense, she wasn't incorrect because the firings of Marijhapi, the displacement from Marijhapi was a very extreme and brutal form of conservation which came to be practiced in many parts of India, consequent upon Project Tiger and similar such reserves being created. If you look roughly between the end of the 1960s and 2000, the area of parks in India grew in a very significant way, from less than 1% of the land area to something like 5%. Now we have to be very careful here. This sort of process, for all the human brutality that it entailed, one looked at the brutality of displacement, groups of people being picked up and resettled in another place. This kind of exclusion didn't only have an overt kind of violence. Let me share with you a more covert form which may not be evident immediately. The lions of the Gir forest, the only ones that are in Asia, it was found by the late 1960s, were preying on a lot of cattle. These cattle were owned by pastoral communities known as the Maldaris who live within the Gir. And something like 70% of the lion's diet consisted of domestic water buffalo. And from the late 1960s, remember Rachel Carson? Pesticides became available. And what starts happening quite systematically is that the pesticides are used not to kill various insect pests, but to poison lions. And in 1974-75, a substantial number of the Maldari settlements were moved out of the Gir forest into cultivated arable elsewhere. About 15-20 years later, the Maldaris are very understudied by scholars, but a very important lion biologist took the trouble to visit some of their villages. Now the Maldaris are very famous because they have buffaloes which give milk with a very high fat content. Now this is a different community from the one in this room. The higher the fat content of the milk, the better the milk is supposed to be. And when Dr. John Singh went in and John sat down and he was given the tea, his host would always apologize for the very low fat content of the milk. And they would point out quite rightly that it was impossible to find proper grazing for their buffaloes. They were unable to take to agriculture. They either didn't know how to do it or they didn't have the implements. And they were actually worse off having been relocated from the forest than they were within the forest. So what we find actually is a contest over different kinds of nature. The saving of nature from one set of people by another set of people is something which is very much a part of nature's past. In this, interestingly, given that in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, Indian politics took a leftward turn, the protection of the tiger, the saving of the lion from extinction, and so on and so forth, had been accompanied by the abolition of the privy purses. The privy purses were a guaranteed income which was given to the princes when they acceded to the Union of India at the time of partition. Now these princes together controlled about a third of the land area. And what would interest you and me is, it's now 1912, 1911, Lord Hardinge wrote a book. And it's a lovely book, it's his diary, until you start reading it. Each chapter is about a visit to a different princely state. It names the princely state and the big game that he shot. So there's the bison of Bandipur, there's the waterfowl of Bharatpur, and so on and so forth. If you look at princely protection, princely protection actually is a model which influenced deeply the statecraft of Republican independent India in the 1970s. Where better to look than the remarkable work of Anne Grodzins-Gold. Anne Grodzins-Gold and Bhojuram Gujar did some remarkable work over the last 15 years, talking to a lot of people who'd lived through the transition from the princely state era into independent India. one informant after another said that they remembered the time of the Savar Raj, the rule of that particular ruler, as a time of both plenty and pain. The plenty was because these vast areas around their villages had brushwood and grassland and hedges and bushes where they could pick berries. So it was a time of great pleasure. You could roam these areas and pick the berries. But it was a time of great pain because from these very bushes and jungle is the right term, scrub tracts, emerged great sounders of wild boar which came and destroyed their crops. And they were not permitted to kill the boar in the defense of their crop. So the Savar Raj was a period of great pain. It was not just the boars attacking the crops. The Raj also extracted from them begar, forms of forced labor. So the begari, forced labor, which also involved multiple forms of personal humiliation, went together with the protection of the boar. The boar in this case was a symbol of the power of these various landed gentries, aristocracies, and princes. This, of course, takes us to this larger question. When the nation state sets out to save nature, it makes interventions. Interventions cannot be seen as mindless or needless in today's world. After all, the India of today has a density of population of about 400 to a square kilometer. I'll now draw on various people who work on earlier ages who've done very complicated number crunching, the sort I'd flinch from, to just give you a sense of how much things have changed. If you looked at 1881, there were 35 people to a square kilometer. There were 70 people to a square kilometer. It's more than a five-fold growth. But why not go back to 1600? Muzaffar Sahib is here, the era of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. The density is 35 to a square kilometer. Why not go further back to the first century of the Common Era? The total population, according to one estimate, of the entire subcontinent is 20 million. 20 million is the population of Greater Delhi or Greater Mumbai today. Greater Delhi plus a few satellite towns. So this huge transformation in terms of numbers has gone together with an expansion of the cultivated arable. The expansion of the cultivated arable, go back to 1600, Akbar, sorry, not Jahangir, roughly, according to one estimate, 1 out of 4 acres, 1 out of 4 hectares was permanently under the plow. Today, 1 out of 2 hectares is permanently under the plow. One of the great differences, after all, historically between India and China is that the valley, the river basins of the Indus, the Ganga, the Brahmaputra, and some of the key peninsular rivers, the Kaveri for one, actually constitute the largest lowland fertile plains in Asia, other than the Huanghe and the Yangtze Kiang. But even within these fertile river plains, it's only very recently that tillage, permanent cultivation, has become such a predominant feature of the landscape. You see this in Mughal hunts. You can see it even later. 1850s, 1857, it's an anniversary, a lot of Indians commemorate, and there's a lot of writing about was it a rebellion, was it an uprising, was it a war of independence. One of the people who helped the retaking of Delhi was a man called George Ackland Smith. Within a day's horse ride of Delhi, Colonel Smith hunted and killed 55 lions. If you go back another 30 years, the commander-in-chief of British forces in India, Komber Meri, came up to Delhi, and very close to Delhi, there's a place called Garhmukteshwar. It's about 5 to 6 hours in a car, faster in a train, and this is where he went tiger hunting. So this landscape has actually been transformed beyond recognition in the very recent past. This does not mean that there was harmony in the past or coexistence. One can find huge transformations earlier, but they were not of this scale and this permanence. The other very closely related transformation, of course, is a political one, the taking of the forest in the late 19th century, the wiping out of certain creatures as vermin, or certain others being protected as game. We looked at both. But the third, equally significant, is the creation in the late 19th century of probably one of the largest modern canal irrigation systems in the valley of the Indus. Pakistan today has the highest per capita irrigated land on earth because of the canal colonies created in the British era. Now, these colonies did not just bring the waters of the Indus and its tributaries to lands where there was very little water. They made it possible to carry out permanent tillage and agriculture. They also replaced a different kind of landscape in which pastoralism was more important, where sedentary agriculture occupied a very small part of the landscape. These three major changes, the creation of this huge forest estate, the transformations in the relationship between people and the animal world, and the creation of these large canal irrigated areas, were to leave a mark on the landscape. What we see today, therefore, is a landscape which has been changed and has been changing for long, but which has undergone changes in the very recent past. One of the issues which one invariably comes up when we look, therefore, at the problems of the environment is how do you make space for nature in such a densely populated country where agriculture predominates in the landscape, where the towns have grown and now house about a third of the population. How do you do so, especially in the post-20th century world of the modern day? How do you do so even more so in a country whose economy is expanding so fast? The last 5-year, 7-year period, roughly 2003 to 10, the economic growth rate in India was about 8%. If you go backward in time, you'd find that the late 20th century was a period of quite considerable economic acceleration. I don't like figures, but bear with me. If you look at the growth rate in the first half of the 20th century, it's about less than half of 1%. I'm talking of economic growth. Look at the first 15 years after independence, it's 4%. You know, Pulapre Balakrishnan has recently argued that the Nehru period, rather than being one of uncreative, dead, mixed economy, planning and socialism, actually saw a huge upwelling and transformation in terms of the pace of economic change. There's another time when the foot hits the accelerator in the 80s when it's over 5%. Now, we have to be very careful. All economic growth doesn't necessarily have negative consequences for the environment. That is a view quite powerfully articulated in 1970 in the Club of Rome report. The Club of Rome said that the great threats to the environment are two things: the growth of human numbers, the growth of the expansion of the economy. This, of course, led to a big debate with the rich countries emphasizing that the threat to the environment is from human numbers, and the developing or the poor countries saying that, you know, you got it all wrong. It's not the number of us, it's the number of you, saying that the inequity between and within nation states was at fault. But the critical point is that the present transformation over the last 30 years, when India has integrated much more into the wider market economy of the globe, I said 30 with deliberation because I would go with the idea that the opening, however tentative, begins not in 91, as is often supposed, but in 1980. It begins after Mrs. Indira Gandhi's return to power. It's interesting that in this period, you find economic growth more so of a kind that does have very adverse environmental consequences. Look at it simply in biophysical terms. 2 months ago, the Center for Science and Environment put out a very interesting report on the opening up of forest lands. And they pointed out that more land had been sanctioned for mining in the last 5 years than the last 30 years. More land had been sanctioned for mining in the last 1 year than the last 5 years. Now, what mines are these? There's coal, very important as a source of energy. Bauxite, very crucial because aluminium is a very important component of the modern economy. Anyone who flies in a plane is a beneficiary of the use of aluminium. There are other very important metals. Iron ore, much of it exported to China. China is a great sump. It draws an iron ore from India and several parts of the world. There's also something else which people tend to forget, which is that India becomes a very important net importer of certain commodities. Take just two. It imports and will continue to import into the next few years high-grade coal from other countries. Wood, very rarely realized that after the 80s, as forestry regulations in India got tightened, India became an importer of wood. These are very direct kinds of impacts, but they can be indirect impacts. One of them would, of course, be that there are very important transformations, not just to the physical space, but of what one may be permitted to call the living landscape. There are transformations of riverfront, floodplain, marsh, coast, mountain, the Trans-Himalaya, the forest, the scrub jungle. I could go on. Many of these transformations therefore call into question the core philosophy that you can protect nature by simply secluding it. Remember Sankla? Our policy is to do nothing and not let anybody do anything. Let's take a closer look. My distinguished colleague MD Madhusudan, unlike me, was a biologist. He grew up in a world where he wanted to study plants and animals. He did not have much of an interest in politics. In a sense, in our very small, humble way, we came from different traditions. You recall the famous lecture of C.P. Snow in 1957, where he said that the world of modern knowledge sees knowledge fragmented into two cultures, the literary cultures and the scientific cultures. He went on to say something which is of profound importance in looking not just at the histories of the environment, but at debates on the environment. He said that these people from these two cultures not only speak a different language, they not only use different methods, they not only do different things, there is, he said, a mutual gulf of incomprehension. They can't even comprehend what the other is doing, saying, thinking, feeling. Now, Madhusudan's work was in a very important tiger reserve called Bandipur. It's a reserve, the Maharaja of Mysore. The few villages there were relocated in the 1970s. It's 800 square kilometers, not too small by Indian standards. It's part of a larger complex. It's the place which has today the largest populations of some of the great ungulates and carnivores that were once part of the larger landscape, not just of India, but of South and Southeast Asia. There's the gaur, a huge wild species of wild cattle, which is 6 feet tall. There's the tiger, there's the elephant, and so on and so forth. Now, what is important about Bandipur is it doesn't suffer from major poaching. It doesn't have resident villagers. But every day, over 100,000 cattle enter Bandipur. And here, Madhusudan's work took him into a different question. Who owns these cattle? Why are they coming into Bandipur? And the answer is, the owners of the cattle were sending them in to collect their cow dung. The cow dung was a major product, not for the household economies of these people, but for sale. The cow dung would be collected, baked into cakes, transported by truck to coffee plantations in the highlands which are nearby. Remember your cup of coffee? When commodity prices go up, they grow more coffee bushes. People want organic coffee. They were replacing chemical fertilizer with organic fertilizer. And the major source of that resource was from Bandipur. So the cow dung of Bandipur, there's a sort of tropic flow, rather than make the tiger the apex of the food chain, maybe the cow dung collector and maybe the humble coffee bush is at the apex of the food chain. So second, this of course leads you to ask, why are people who are cultivators collecting cow dung? To answer this, you have to ask, what are among the biggest problems of a cultivator? That's easy. It's in common with all of us. It's servicing loans. And as we all know, when you service a loan, the most important question is what's the rate of interest? The rate of interest, the bottom rate of interest for these small cultivators. This is India. 80% of the cultivators have holdings of less than 1 hectare. The servicing of loans begins at 35%. If you're servicing a loan at 35%, you're dependent on the monsoon. The monsoon may fail. You will have a failure of monsoon, very crudely put, once in 3 to once in 5 years. You need something very important, cash. The cow dung is the means of getting cash on the nail. There's something else. You've raised the cash. You've managed to grow a crop. You have food. You need to cook it. And now comes something more interesting. 20,000 families, approximately 5 per family, depend on this same forest for fuel wood. Because most of the forest guards are drawn from the very communities of the people who either own the cattle or extract the wood or both, you can't expect them to stop people from entering the forest. Here we see something very significant and a big transformation from the days of the princes or the British, which is that in 50 years or 60 years, 1952 was the first general election of elective democracy, 68% of all Indians own a cell phone. And if a group of villagers is stopped from taking out firewood, which is required for their hearth, this is not an area where there's a large commercial firewood trade, I can assure you they will, irrespective of the time of day or night, call their local elected representative. Now, India is a large country, 1 billion people, 3 million elected representatives. They won't call the panchayat head, the village council head. They'll call the member of the legislative assembly. If that's not enough, they'll call the MP. And they will not bother whether it's 1, 2, or 3 in the morning. So the political system, in a sense, which ensured that such peoples could be liberated from begari, could be liberated from the humiliations, the servitude, the hierarchies of the imperial, the feudal past, also becomes the means by which there's a sieve. The forest of Bandipur, which is a refuge for the gaur and the elephant and the tiger, is also a source of resources for livelihood. It's a resource catchment for a large number of people around it who are effectively in a livelihood crisis. It's a crisis of livelihood because you cannot expect them not to cook a meal, not to service the lawn, and not to graze their crop. We had a student who was a biologist who decided for her master's thesis in Bangalore to look at some of these peasants. And what she did on the cultivation was 2 villages. It complicates the picture. In that village, she found they were able to keep the animals away. They decided not to grow food crops, but cotton. And cotton fetches a better price. And the cotton stalks were their main source of energy for that time of the year. These people had another problem. The cotton merchants came from the southern state of Tamil Nadu. You cross the state border, they'd get off, they'd buy the cotton. Now, I won't get into the fact that the terms of trade are against the cultivator. Just the fact that, remember when the rains fail, what happens? There's very little water in the river. The river which links Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, very important in all of our cultures, celebrated by poets down the ages, is the Kaveri. And something very important about the Kaveri. In the last 80 years, both states have built dams. They've drawn huge amounts of water from the Kaveri. This is all very well as long as the rains are fine. But the year the rains fail, the net amount of water drawn by the 2 states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala is more than the amount of water in the river. This then leads to the closure of the border, huge demonstrations in Tamil Nadu saying, please open the sluice gates, we want the water. Counter demonstrations in Karnataka saying, don't open the sluice gates, it's our water. The merchants don't come. The cotton crop goes for a toss, and those people head out into the forest and chop even more wood because now they have to sell some wood for a living. In other words, you can't seclude this reserve entirely from economic processes, from the flows of materials and commodities, from the flows of labor, whether cattle or human, and you can't seclude it in a positive sense. Last year when we were beginning to write this, we found a nice way to do it. We stayed in a house owned by a friend. We went to a local Vokalega village to catch up on gossip and have lunch. And in the evenings, we drive into Bandipur and Mudumalai. It's interesting, these are reserves which are part of a contiguous tract of forest. The total is 5, 6, 7, 8, 6, 7,000 square kilometers. And the areas that abut the forest, which is protected, some is village land, some is grazing land, some of it is other forms of forest, has a lot of wildlife. We spent a lovely morning watching a wild dog. After some time, we realized that he too was watching us. He was the lookout in the pack. He was supposed to keep an eye on us so that we didn't cut. And then, you know, this very interesting dog, it doesn't bark, it whistles. I can't make the sound. I'm very bad at those things. And he did that and they all ran away. Now, this wild dog, or the deer, which they were possibly stalking, were in an area around Bandipur. Nature doesn't observe boundaries. Wild dogs cross the boundaries, just as cow dung collectors do. How do you establish rigid boundaries with something that is inherently fluid? We're familiar with this when we look at the movements of people. But we ought to remember that it applies when you try to seclude and save nature, not just to animals or to birds or to commodities, but also to substances which are introduced into the environment. If you're willing to do it and board a bus or take a car, not far from Delhi is a fascinating place. Over 100 years ago, the rulers of Bharatpur decided to please their British masters or overlords or partners, whichever way you put it. They transformed a very dry area into a wetland. They put a bund across a local river. This became a wintering ground for geese and ducks. And right up to 1960, there would be huge hunts where they'd shoot thousands of ducks and geese for visiting royalty, for British officers. Now, the Kelade of Ghana had something very interesting. From the 1950s and 40s, it had biologists who were beginning to work in it. One of them was a very famous man, Dr. Salim Ali, who wrote the Book of Indian Birds in the 40s, a very important book. It was used, among others, for bird watching by Jawaharlal Nehru when he was in jail. Didn't have very much else to do. And in the 1990s, one of Salim Ali's lineal descendants in his group found something very interesting. Up to the 1990s, wherever you were in mainland India, if you looked up into the sky, you saw vultures. There are 3 species of vultures. I won't go into the detail. They're widespread. Among other things, which one tends to forget, is that India not only has a disproportionate amount of land which can be transformed for cultivation, it also has one of the largest populations of domestic ungulates on earth. If you do a head count, 1 out of every 6 people on earth, little more, is an Indian. But 1 out of every 5 cows, bulls, donkeys, mules, horses, yaks, so on and so forth, are in India. When they die, the vultures eat them. And Vibhu Prakash didn't realize it. It took 7-8 years to put the puzzle together. The vultures are dying. We estimate 95, 97% of them are gone. And the reason they're gone, remember Rachel Carson, is because the injection of a drug into the buffaloes and the cows and the goats and the horses works its way up the food chain, diclofenac. It causes certain chemical changes in the vulture's body, due to which the eggshell thickness goes down and hatchling survival rates go down and finally to 0. This again is a reminder that you can't secure nature by simply secluding it. You're looking at nature as part of a larger living landscape, a mosaic, whether it's the wild dogs traveling out, whether it's people coming in. And you need to think of alternatives which build around livelihoods. You need to think of alternatives which build around systems that are fluid. I can talk in much more detail about what those could be. But I think that there are 2 things here which stand out, and I'd like to end with them. One, of course, is the fact that the status model has its limits. It also has, not to forget, its uses. You need a government, federal, union, or local, to put some curbs on resource extraction, because there are some systems which are in free fall. I doubt very much if the tiger would survive if that protective umbrella were removed. I'm even more sure of the lions of the Gir forest, because they have a limited gene pool. These are the only lions of the Asian subspecies anywhere in the world, which everyone in Gujarat will tell you very proudly. But the reverse is equally important. If you simply devolve power and hand over power, that won't work either, because that may lead to a greater market anarchy. If you give power to all the people around the villages of Bandipur, given no other change, they would have even greater incentive to go into the forest. How do we change that around? One way, of course, is to begin with the problem. And Madhusudan's answer, just to put the principle, is to address that problem of credit. It has a very good starting point. One of the problems a cultivator faces, even if they simply do cultivation, is that most cultivation, a lot of it, is about growing cereal. And if you grow a field of ripening ragi, sorghum, pearl millet, it's recreating a grassland situation for the largest and most intelligent of herbivores, the elephant. One of India's very important scientists, I believe, is here at Chicago recently, Sukumar. I must be careful because there's lots of other research saying other things. But Sukumar did a lot of work around 30 years ago where he showed that a disproportionate amount of elephant raiding on crops is by rampaging bull parties, the groups of male elephants who get together and go on a rampage. And Sukumar came up with a lot of evolutionary reasons of why they do. There may be people who believe that this is not unique to elephants. It may be true of other species as well. Madhusudan's answer has been to try not to fence the forest. The elephants will always get through. They're intelligent animals. They can crawl under the fence. They can unmake it. They've been known to fill moats. They're also capable of using their tusks to test whether the current is strong enough, working out that the tusk is a non-conductor, ripping apart the trunk and going through. And there's nobody to put the fence back. This is a government matter, remember. So his answer has been to get a group of cultivators together, raise the money, put in a fence, keep out the elephants and the boars, but have them maintain it. But this has 2 pluses. Once you start doing it, the chances are, and in this case it happened, they pulled money together, put a bore well, shifted to double cropping, and started tying up and feeding their cattle at home, because the main product shifted from cow dung to milk. And they start supplying milk through a cooperative because you have chilled plants. So the market, the credit system, modern technology, rather than being disempowering devices, become devices of empowerment. They also are means of enablement. They enable the forest to recover. When you have so many fewer people going in to take the resource flows out of cow dung, you're also providing more nutrients to the soil. Closely related to this is another initiative in the area which provides cooking gas at a subsidized rate to a lot of these villages, barring about 15 to 20% who are so poor that they can't afford the subsidy. This has led in many cases to a shift from fuel wood to cooking gas. Now I know there are people who say that this is a shift from a renewable source of energy, wood, to a non-renewable. But when you look at the larger landscape, you would want to ask yourself, what is it that you'd like to ensure survives? And I would argue that rather than use notions of species, wild dogs, tigers, vultures, one also has to look at notions of ecological integrity. Bandipur has a greater kind of ecological integrity than most other adjacent landscapes. And in this situation, there's a big plus in using cooking gas, because a lot of the wood collection is done by women. And the kind of support that has come for cooking gas from them, it surprised the people who tried the initiative. So can one have a sense of living landscapes, a mosaic, build around existing problems? I think all of this will work, provided the democratic process reins in the kind of economic growth we're having. One of the major transformations in recent years, and I'll stop here, was that in 2006, India enacted a Forest Rights Act. The kind of tenancy reform, abolition of landlordism, land to the tiller, which has taken place with the cultivated arable, has not taken place in the forest. There are across India large numbers of people living within forest owned by government with no rights whatsoever. There are also people adjacent to the forest dependent on it. They may be dependent for fuel, for fodder, for a whole lot of other necessities. Now this act not only gives Gram Sabhas, the local village council, the right to say no to an industrial project, it also gives them the power to negotiate better terms. One of the very important projects which made headlines was in the foothills of the Niyamgiri in Orissa. It caught the attention of periodicals like Time magazine, who compared the Dongariya Konds, who are a tribe who practices shifting cultivation and gleaning of the forest, to the doomed people in the film Avatar. And I think the analogy is not entirely apt, because the Dongariya Konds, their allies among various people who want to work for forest rights, combined with others who were concerned with the survival, in this case, of the elephant, because this is a very important elephant corridor, and managed to stall and stop the allocation of this land for a very large bauxite mine by one of the very large companies on earth, Vedanta. It helped, sometimes does, that one of India's most powerful politicians, Rahul Gandhi, in 2008 had visited the Niyamgiri tribals and told them that if they ever wanted to fight, he was a soldier for their cause. This is a very important and larger question. Can democracy be an enabler for transformation? Can the nation state, I talked about the nation state as disabling people, depriving them of rights, displacing them, depriving them of livelihood, facilitating certain hierarchies of the forest. There's a beautiful phrase used by C.S. Lewis where he said that some men use nature as an instrument of power over other men. Some men or women use the nation as an instrument of power over other men and women and the natural world. But can that process at all be checked? Are there interstices that allow for different kinds of mediations? And I would argue that rather than fall prey to counsels of despair, because the environmental movement, particularly the wing of it that looks at nature, comes up with books such as The End of the Wild, The Death of Nature, The Revenge of Gaia, and so on and so forth. And I share and sympathize with these views. But I think that it will be profoundly mistaken not to realize that this large process we've lived through of the end of the colonial era and the enabling, in the Indian case, of a republican democracy also allows for opportunities. This larger work we were looking at, conserving nature as if democracy mattered, has a larger application when one looks at perspectives on India's environmental history. I haven't looked at the longer history. Needless to say, this is a landscape where there are centuries, in fact millennia of human engagements with nature. What one can say is that we're living through a period which poses huge challenges, but also has very exciting, in fact, I would say, fascinating opportunities. It is up to us to take up that challenge. Thank you.
I think we can ask Mahesh to take some questions.
Mahesh, thank you for a fascinating lecture. I learned a lot. And as you said, those were extremely inspiring examples, the one or two that you gave. And I want to start from where you ended. Because one of the problems in talking about Indian democracy, it seems to me, is that we take the meaning of the word for granted. So when we speak of Indian democracy, we assume that we know what we mean. But on the ground, Indian democracy is so many different kinds of processes, and the electoral process. So as you were talking about the process of empowerment, a lot of what you said made complete sense. But I was thinking of people already empowered by our democracy, who at the moment are just destroying mines and forests, and this completely wild kind of mafia capitalism in the resources sector that's going on, which is very closely tied to politician-criminal nexus, closely tied to the electoral process, very closely tied to the kind of protection that police force can give them, the corruption of the Indian police force, and the problem actually of Indian Federation, that the police force is a state subject, law and order is a state subject, which actually, there could be a debate about to what degree that leaves it vulnerable, with other factors like low pay and, our police force is mainly to maintain law and order, and they're not an investigative agency, the skills are low. So I was thinking, going back to this recent murder of this IAS officer in Madhya Pradesh. In West Bengal, after the new government came into power, I don't know if you have caught up with this, there was a very enthusiastic forestry officer called Mirza somebody, who was trying to shut down all the illegal timber factories in North Bengal, and he has just been transferred. And they've actually put somebody else in charge of the ministry, so that the illegal timber factories can go on. So I was going to ask you this question, that in some ways one sees so many vignettes of Indian democracy, so many sides to it, and whether one becomes optimistic or whether it becomes despairing. I mean, there's a market for optimism, there's a market for despair. Despairing books sell, optimistic books also sell. They sell in different markets in different ways. So let's put the pure preference for optimism and despair to one side. But factually, given the diversity of examples in India, and they're both optimistic and examples that produce, how do you, I don't question your personal preference to jump for the optimistic scenario. But is there any rational ground for a choice between the two?
Thank you. This is a very fundamental question. No, I think you should disregard my personal preference. I think that's not important.
No, I'm not personal preference.
I do. So do I. But I think that, I put your question if I may, in a larger frame, and I think it can go beyond India. Is democracy actually porous? Is it impervious? Is it impervious to these positive impulses for the greater common good? Is it actually not just porous, but is it a facilitator for certain processes and actions which can be deeply disruptive? And I think I'd go with you. You referred to linkages between electoral processes, predatory kinds of economic interests, and the larger economic transformation which we're living through. In many ways, one could argue, and I didn't have time to go into it, that India is perhaps in a situation where, with the rise of really large corporate capital, electoral processes which involve much larger mobilizations of resources, men, muscle, cash, than ever before. It's not very dissimilar to the United States prior to the progressive conservation era of Roosevelt. You have very large private players without a regulatory environment. And the processes of Indian capitalism, for their own survival, probably would do well to have a better regulatory environment. My question is actually not to do with optimism and pessimism. It's to go back to the question of process. Of course, there's serious issues with democracy. Democracy is predicated on the idea of individual equality. Every one of us is endowed with equal rights, irrespective of our origins, status, or wealth. But this is true, this is being attempted in a society which has both old layers of hierarchy and new kinds of hierarchy. Think of any kind of exclusion, it's practiced on a substantial scale in India. You put virtually any kind of exploitation, it's there in some form in India. You look at any form of exploitation of nature, which results in destruction, and exclusion vis-a-vis access to nature, you'll find its counterpart in India. Our question is a more fundamental one, Professor. It is, how do we go forward? Forget about the politics, that's not important, that's a question of engagement. But even intellectually, one answer to this is to have more state regulation which concentrates power upward. My submission is that that may be look like a salvation, but there is always a trapdoor at the top through which the same interests which you're trying to block out at the bottom will get in. And this vast clearance of forest areas for mining is one instance of that. The other is to devolve power. It's to have power at the base. Very fine recent work, Mukul Sharma, Green and Saffron, shows that if you look at one of the celebrated instances of village empowerment, in the case of Anna Hazare's Ralegaon Siddhi, where the water, soil has been revived, it's actually been incredibly problematic because older hierarchies have been reinvented. You can't have more than 2 children. You may not listen to anything except patriotic songs. If you watch, you can't have cable TV. You're not allowed to drink. You may not eat meat. And most important, those who violate this are whipped in public by him. This is admitted by him and he has defended the practice. In such a situation, our question is somewhat different, if I may. It is, what are the kinds of engagement that are possible? Of course, democracy is open to multiple meanings, but we are talking of democracy which goes beyond mere exercise of franchise, important enough, free and fair, the mere right to throw your ruler out, important enough, historically new, it wasn't there till very long ago. But talking of democracy, I would submit in 2 other very significant ways. One of them is a democracy which gives people to live, which recognizes the right of people to live with dignity in material terms. One of the big transformations in India is the present debate on the Food Security Act. We've just been through an important legislation now in force on the right to work in rural areas. These are limited. They're full of potholes. There are many problems with them. But these are fundamental transformations in a society. This is a society which up to date had not enacted for individual poor citizens the right to work in any form. It is presently debating the right to food in some form. I would argue that when you're looking at the problem of nature within, I'm referring to this nation state, and I think this principle applies in several others, a rights-based approach may actually have more positive consequences than either simply a statist or a devolutionist approach. My second point is more serious. The enormous power of corporate capital, bureaucratic power, the kind of elected politicians who may not just bow to but facilitate these, cannot be controlled simply by scholarly social scientists, nice social activists, and intelligent biologists. This community, significant as it is in the processes of public debate, lacks the clout and the capability. The reason, and I come back to Niyamgiri, I can give you half a dozen other instances. 3 dams in Uttarakhand on which government had spent 1,500 crore on the upper reaches of the Ganga, a very important uranium mine, please note, uranium mine in Meghalaya. The neutrino, it's very important, 5-kilometer long corridor where they're going to do neutrino testing, very important for Indian science. It was coming up in the corridor where we were watching wild dogs. The Niyamgiri case, one can multiply these, demonstrate that because there is a rights-based approach of the Forest Rights Act, there is a chance. For every one of these cases, I cited 5, you can cite 50 where it failed. But my submission is that if you are looking at a complex situation, however complex the situation, you do need to ask, whatever your ideal, you may have any ideal, how will you reach that ideal by identifying with certain elements in the situation? And I would submit that the kind of economic processes that are there, the way the political processes are meshing them, simply talking ecological sanity, common sense will not help. It seems to me that there is a substantial ground for alliances, both of a constructive sort, which I focused on, but also others which may be protest-based. So I share all your concerns. I completely agree with you. I would say factually, on rational ground, I would humbly submit that we ought to consider this as a very serious possibility. No more. I'm sure we can continue the debate.
Let me ask a question, because following on what we mean by democracy, let's ask what we mean by nature.
Excellent.
And you've provided the kind of a nice encapsulation of the familiar story of fortress conservation with its history of displacement and unintended consequences. And certainly part of the issue, as you've outlined in forest conservation, is the definition of what nature is being protected. and what nature is being destroyed so that another might be protected, or whose nature is being protected. Right? So that the very definition of what constitutes nature under any particular moment or regime, right, is a state project, or at least a project of some form of authoritative knowledge production. What's to prevent the mosaic model or the matrix model from suffering from similar fates of unintended consequences in the necessary and routine bureaucratic acts of the definition of nature?
I don't think there's an answer to that. You have to try it out and see. What we have to ask is that are there certain secular processes in the statist model or the fortress model which will reproduce themselves in whatever, matrix, mosaic models? I submit they will if we simply rely on bureaucratic engagement. I'll give you a small instance. One of our problems with the elephant task force is that while Indians love elephants, combined we kill about, I'm just saying Indians, all Indians don't do it, about 100 elephants a year. 60 out of 100 elephants roughly are killed for crop protection. They're not being killed for their tasks. But there's a reverse. 1,500 people, 400 people a year are killed by elephants. They're cultivators, they're laborers. There are systems of compensation. 500,000 people are affected by elephant crop damage. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or biologist to know that an elephant tramping through your field doesn't leave very much of the crop. The field may survive. And our finding, not very surprising, is that the kind of corruption, the petty humiliations, the absence of any protective arm of the state is evident in everyday life. And one of our approaches, I don't think it's a working, it's a perfect solution, is that at the beginning and the end of the cropping season, the harvest season and the cropping season. So when you harvest the crop and prior to that when you sow the crop, we suggested public hearings in which you have elected representatives involved to ensure that this flow happens. Now this won't be enough because it's more complicated. Those people need crop insurance. Nobody in India, no public sector body will insure you against wild animal attack unless you show that you're able to protect your field. Your insurance people won't pay for your car insurance unless you show that you're capable of locking your car. It's something similar to that. I would submit that this takes us back to the more fundamental problem. Do you believe that people are capable of deciding what is in their best interests or not? It's a very profound philosophical question. It admits of more than one answer. But I would submit that one of the transformations, which I didn't talk about, over the last 30 years in India, is that democracy, which was earlier about elections, voting someone in, voting someone out, has acquired more meaning for more people than ever before. I'd refer to the rise of Dalit politics. I could refer to the increasing clout of Adivasi or tribal voters. Very important with the Forest Rights Act. One of the criticisms of the Forest Rights Act, and it's no great secret, these are all good friends of mine. Several of them have spent their lives studying very rare animals, and they said this is a victory of vote bank politics. And he also went and testified before the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, which had 12 members. I'll have to explain this, and said, sirs, gentlemen, ladies, I'm extremely worried about this act. It will mean we are mandalizing the forest. We're bringing the politics of affirmative action, positive discrimination to the forest. The chairman rather gently pointed out the mandal refers to backward classes for whom in 1990 government set aside a section of jobs in state services. So he was saying you're bringing caste politics into the forest and using the term mandal. So the chairman very gently pointed out that 4 of the 12 members of the committee had the surname Mandal, and it was somewhat impolitic of him to point this out. It may not help his case. End of the story. So I think that in this case, vote bank politics has actually enabled people to gain land rights. It has also worked for a very strange reason, something we may not be sympathetic to. The Forest Rights Act provided for collective management of certain forest areas. Dead letter, hasn't happened. But it provided for people who are already cultivating to gain land title. That has happened. So here you find a commonality of private property with voting rights. And interestingly, if you look at all the English newspapers in India, they all, to the last man and woman, oppose the Forest Rights Act. They said it will mean the death of the forest. They're not quite so enthusiastic when it comes to opposing mining, dams, However, the paper which supported it was the Economic Times. They said, hey, it's the victory of private property. We're so happy. We've been saying this all along. Private property is good, the state is bad. And here my answer is that, this is a personal choice. I want to say this as a citizen, that I would go with the philosophy of Deng Xiaoping. I don't think what matters is the color of the cat, whether it's black or white. I think it matters whether it catches mice or not. You are living in a capitalist political social order. You cannot, in a situation where everybody in rooms such as this, not this one, but in India, has either a credit card, lives in a house, drives a car, at least owns a bicycle, you tell an entire section of people that, you know what, I don't think you're quite ready for property rights yet. So I think that we have to engage with democracy, draw on its ability to expand the notion of democracy beyond narrow political to social and economic rights. There is no silver bullet. There is no magic solution. If someone is looking for one, sorry, wrong number. And if you want to look at status systems that collapse, I advise you to read at least the preface to one of the funniest and finest books I've ever read, When a Billion Chinese Jump. It's a man called Jonathan Watts, who was told, his little boy growing up in England, by his father and mother that he should pray every night that a billion Chinese don't jump, because if they jump, the earth will fall off its axis. Well, he's found the billion Chinese are not just jumping, they're moving really fast. And the scale of environmental transformation in China is so rapid. The construction of the Three Gorges River Dam, the linking of the rivers of the north and south, the huge transformations in the grazing lands of North China. There's a marvelous novel called Wolf Totem, which tells it from the viewpoint of the Mongolian pastoralist nomads. Now, in the Indian case, the river interlinking scheme is held up because one state will not share its waters with the other. It's also held up because it's a very expensive project. And I might add, it's held up because there's resistance from people who will be displaced. So I think democracy, with its pluses and minuses, we must be careful. We shouldn't idealize this. Stopping river interlinking is not enough. You need other answers to other questions. But I think that it's a question of trying to blend the democratic process with this expansion of rights, with all these ecological and social insights which we have been garnering over the last so many decades. Hopefully someone is listening, but it's worth a try. Sorry.
I have a question about nature's future, more so than its past, and I was wondering if you could weigh in on climate change. This is something that obviously cannot be fenced in or isolated. So what happens when, not if, the environmental challenges that come along with climate change become so much bigger than the local, so much bigger than even the nation state? What kinds of engagement do you see for the future, not just of India, but for other communities and nations in the face of climate change?
That's a really large question. Call for a large new lecture. I will go to the past. I am a student of history. I still think it helps. One of the first professors, the first professor of ecology to get his photo on the cover of Time magazine was Barry Commoner. They called him professor with a class of millions. And he had a group called the St. Louis Committee for Environmental Information. Prior to that, it was called the St. Louis Committee for Nuclear Information. Now, they're not talking about nuclear war, they're talking about nuclear testing. In the 1950s, it was found that nuclear tests by various powers, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, the French, the British, were releasing various substances, strontium-90, caesium-37, and these were lodging in the soil, the water, the bone marrow. There were two very critical reasons why between 1957, when men like Barry Commoner got going, and 1963, the nation states of the world signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. One of them is that some of the leaders of particular countries were lobbied by their scientific advisors. If you read Schlesinger's book, 1,000 Days, Jack Kennedy is looking out on the White House lawn. He's not listening to the scientific advisor. He's thinking about something else. And he keeps saying, Mr. President, those radioactive substances are out there. They're in the soil. They're in the water that's falling right down on the White House lawns. And he turns around and says, are you saying that those radioactive substances are here on the lawn? He said, yes. You mean when my children go to play there, they're exposed to them? He said, yes. And I would submit that it would be very important in that history to give some credit to Jawaharlal Nehru, who from from 1954 to 63, 63 is a declining, probably dying man, it's after the 62 war, continuously pushes for the nuclear test ban treaty. Now, there's a difference. With the nuclear tests, you were banning a very specific activity. No tests in the atmosphere, no tests in the water. The French still didn't sign up, they came in much later. How do you get the leaders of nation states not only to realize that something is in the common interest, but it is in their own interest? The same principle that applied to our friends growing ragi at the edge of Bandipur applies to the leaderships of nation states. Here we come to a problem. The leaders of nation states are influenced by other people. One person who's worth studying as a role model, and you're going to be surprised by who I cite, would be Ronald Reagan. It's under Ronald Reagan that the United States, with the nations of the world, signed the Montreal Protocol. Your university is very famous for Professor Rangarajan, who I've never had the privilege of meeting. His brother is an old friend of mine, and he's written a book, half of which is about this. The reason Ronald Reagan supported the Montreal Protocol, which enabled transition from refrigerating substances which deplete the ozone layer to substances which don't, is because one of his big donors, companies and corporate interests, DuPont, had developed the technology. And in an unprecedented act, the United States agreed that the UN, indirectly the US, would fund technology transfer. Unfortunately, they wrote into the treaty that this will not be treated as a precedent for the future. So I think with climate change, we face a different problem. We're living through an epochal transformation in world affairs. In the 20th century, very important countries which had had a colonial, or if you like, semi-colonial past, attained political power. They are presently in a situation of attaining economic prominence. And I share with you your concern. If countries such as China and India were to adopt the living standards of the United States, you'd need several planets to fulfill that resource demand, and it would have huge consequences, not only for the global atmosphere, but for a whole lot of associated processes. But I would submit that even this requires greater engagements with democracy. It worries me to see advocacy that economic growth should be frozen in countries where several people have not had its benefits. I don't cover elections now, but in 2007, I spent 3 years in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. You drive through the UP rural areas at night, it's dark on both sides. And the reason is 70% of the houses do not have an electricity connection. So how do you combine that aspiration for some sort of a material dignity with the principle of keeping the planet habitable? I don't know. I think the international system managed to address those very specific issues, nuclear test ban, ozone, and it's not very good with climate change. One reason is that with climate change, there are so many linkages. It's related to virtually the entire spectrum of human economic, or if you like, / ecological activity or environmental activity. And I think we should be a little careful in thinking not just about what we want, but how to get there. And I don't see a situation today, part of the reason is the economic crisis in the dominant countries and the continuing economic growth rates in the other countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, China. I don't see the first being able to impose something on the second, but I'm not quite sure the second are going to get what they want either. So how do we get there? You still need economic growth. Can you have economic growth with other kinds of an energy base? Will the knowledge for those other kinds of energy base be shared? Who is going to share it with whom? So this takes you to more fundamental questions, because each country, many countries have different economic systems. But I would submit, and I don't have an answer, it's not something I've spent so much time thinking about, that without somewhere trying out these principles, I'm not sure we'll have much of a chance. I'm afraid that's how I see it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Back to something slightly more manageable scale,
Yes.
maybe. But
Yes.
back to the example of the forest and the cow dung and
Yes.
the cattle. I just wanted to press you on maybe clarifying this. This seems to me to be a situation not of a problem of empowering people by giving them property rights, but rather regulating the use you put those property rights to, right?
Sure.
So then that resembles more the sort of problem that, say, Elinor Ostrom has analyzed, the
Yes.
common pool resource management
Yes.
problem.
Yes.
Would you
Which
agree?
goes back to regulation.
Right. So then the problem is to modernize the resource management, to infuse it with ecological principles, rather than to have it be a top-down, cumbersome state intervention.
Can I just
Sure.
add right into that? Actually, Mahesh, both going back to Maura's large question about climate change and Frederick's sort of focus on the local, it just seems to me that while you're right in India, on the ground, the rights-based approach seems to pay off, rather than the statist regulatory approaches, because our state apparatuses are so decrepit in what they can do. But it seems to me that if you want a thriving democracy, in the end, the aspect of regulation and the aspect of rights have to speak
Of course
to
I
each
do.
other.
Of course I do.
And even with the climate regime, for instance, it wouldn't work if governments internally didn't have proper regulatory regimes.
Sure.
Right? So that in some ways maybe they're not at loggerheads, those
No,
two.
sure.
And
No pun intended.
yes.
No, let me clarify. I think, you see, my way of looking at it is that the nation state is a reality. All people anywhere in the planet live either within a nation state, or an area claimed by two nation states, or an area aspiring to be another nation state, or some more. We can go into that. The issue of empowerment and common property. Yes, I would very strongly go with the notion of common pool resources, enablement and working. However, and this is with the greatest respect for Ellen Ostrom, we need to acknowledge that. I think the environmental debate often doesn't. She does. The environmental debate has done something fascinating. It's taken agriculture out of the equation. We talk forests, tribals, access. These are people who are agriculturists in a very basic sense. They are trying to grow crops. They're tending cattle, they're fishing, they're herding. In the world of agriculture, we are looking at private property rights. I agree with you. A regulation, no cattle into Bandipur, won't work. A regulation, we'll fence the elephants into the forest, won't work. The cultivator's cattle will break the first. I guarantee you the elephants will break the second. What I am submitting is that there is a different principle at work. That is, certain small private holders, if their transition in terms of means, mechanisms of production, credit are facilitated, one important epiphenomenal impact will be the securing of the forest. Sounds very dicey, but let me put it to you. Many forest areas have survived. Many marshes have survived. Many estuaries have survived because of epiphenomenal conservation. They've not survived because someone protected them. They were survived because someone did something else and had this impact. So my submission is, of course we need to continue protecting the forest. We also need to have common pool resources. You can have both. You can have the statist forest for these big animals which need 700-800 square kilometers. You can combine that with smaller scale conservation of ponds, woodlots, lakes, and so on and so forth. But we still need to engage with the small producer. And the small producer will have another impact. More productive small agriculture will generate more jobs. One of the reasons there's an adjacent park called Nagarhole. The western half has no firewood problem. Now the reason is very important. Laborers in the coffee estate are not only paid better than people in rice fields, coffee generates a lot of biomass. So instead of going into the forest and chopping wood and getting chased by elephants, bears, and all of those creatures, you can get biomass from the coffee. Of course you need statist regulation. But the question is very important. You need to keep asking why. Why is the statist system so amenable to the bagman, the money man, the big guy, and not to the small? Back to a problem of democracy. Of course we need state regulation. I prefer the term public action. But I would submit you need it at different levels. You need governments, I prefer the term governments to states, to put down yeas and nos. What may you not do, what may you do. They've done that. Forest Conservation Act, you may not transfer so many hectares, but it's happening all the time. The Forest Rights Act gives people who live there and next to the forest a right to say no for the first time. Similarly, the regulatory regime can do something else also. It can facilitate certain changes. I haven't talked about it, but if you look at Business Line 2 weeks ago, there's a fascinating article by someone from one of the large auto companies, TVS. India has India disposes 250,000 automobiles per year. One of the differences, I'm going to feel very nice about this, between a car which you buy in the United States and India is that in the United States, Japan and Western Europe, the manufacturer has an obligation to take the car back. In India, it ends up in a junkyard. Now, his argument is that recycling, if done in a planned and phased way, can, say by 2020, meet, I forget, 1 million tons of steel of reasonable quality at 100,000 tons of bauxite. It will save energy, it will save water, it will also cut down on mining. Now, for that, you need some government policy to enable that. This is a pilot project, whether it's my friends with the cultivators or even this big corporate giant doing recycling. So I would submit that we need a complex menu of approaches. We need to have adaptive responses in different situations. One size, sorry, these are cliches, but I think they work here. One size will not fit all, but the principles, just as you think of ecological integrity, you also would do well, in my humble opinion, to build in democracy. If you don't do that, nation states, because of the nature of the international system, irrespective of their political order, tend to move in one direction. You see that very clearly over the last 60 odd years. There's a very interesting negotiation in 45, I'm sure you're familiar, when Churchill asked Stalin, what about the Pope, dividing up Europe? And Stalin said, the Pope, how many divisions and battalions does he have? And that's not what rulers say today. They said, how big is his GDP? How much software do they have? How many cars do they make? And I think the countervailing logic is a powerful one, but it needs serious support. And it will not get that support through rhetorical devices, through, sorry to use the word, alarmism. It will, however, get enormous traction if it addresses the problems of people, the even partial resolution of which would create spaces for nature. To get spaces for nature, to aim for a peace with nature, I haven't even defined it, I won't even try. You also need to have peace among people. You can't have peace in a condition where people can't live with human and material dignity. Democracy may or may not be the best way of getting there, but it is worth a much more serious try. That's all I'm trying to argue. Thank you.